Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I want to welcome you to this webinar presentation on Future-Proof Your Logistics Operations to Build a Resilient Business, presented by SAP. One quick reminder, there will be a question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Now, we have all witnessed the rapid changes in demand and supply that businesses have faced in recent years. Every enterprise today is acutely aware of the need to develop resiliency in logistics and the supply chain. It's the key to growing revenue, increasing margins, managing sustainability, and delighting customers. So today, we're going to feature a conversation between three high-profile experts about the role of supply chain and logistics in making business operations future-proof. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Adrian Gonzalez is president at the online video series and blog Talking Logistics. Adrian has more than 20 years of research experience in transportation management, logistics outsourcing, global trade management, social media, and other supply chain related topics. Adrian is also the founder and president of Adelante SCM, a peer-to-peer networking community for supply chain and logistics executives and young professionals, and Indago, a market research service for supply chain and logistics practitioners who share practical knowledge while giving back to charitable causes. Jason Pant is Vice President of Global Information Services at OWENS Corning. He leads Asia Pacific IT, IT Supply Chain Center of Excellence, Manufacturing IT, Enterprise Architecture, and supports all IT activities for Composites. Jason joined Owens Corning in 1998 as subject matter expert in manufacturing systems. In this role, he led numerous improvement projects, including implementation of integrated production labeling, automated production systems, and the first MES implementations. Jason also played an integral role in the implementation of SAP at Owens Corning, including subject matter expert, solution architect, technical lead, and project manager. And Bill King is Director of Digital Logistics Solutions Management at SAP. He is responsible for global strategy, thought leadership, and go-to-market activities. Bill has spent over 20 years delivering solutions that support both international and domestic transportation operations. He's held leadership positions in product management, solutions management, and consulting during his logistics career. Prior to working at SAP, he was product director for the Manugistics TMS at JDA. So with that, I want to turn it over to our speakers for today, starting with Adrian Gonzalez. Adrian, please give us a brief review of what you're talking about today.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And thank you for all of you that are joining us here today. It's certainly my pleasure to share the stage with Jason and Bill to, talk about this, very important, topic and timely topic that, seems to be dominating the conversation, certainly over the past 2 years. And I think that, when you talk about resilience, again, it's top of mind for many supply chain logistics executives, as I'll show in just a moment, but it's not a new topic, per se. It's something that for at least a decade has been, talked about, but we'll get into why it's arguably even more important today for companies to, to focus on this. I think as we get started with this conversation, I think it's important to, start by defining, supply chain resilience. What does it mean to build a resilient business? And I particularly like a definition that was put forth by Stephen Melnick from Michigan State University, and along with some other colleagues in an article they wrote back in 2015. And they defined resilience as the ability of a supply chain to both resist disruption and recover operational capability after disruptions occur. So again, capabilities to resist disruptions and then recover operational capability after a disruption, occurs. And certainly there are many things that companies can do to minimize the risk of a disruption. Whether it's, making sure that they have alternate sources of supply, investing in visibility so that they can be more proactive in taking action to minimize any kind of risk. But the reality is that supply chain management is about disruptions. I mean, it's exceptions happen all the time. Things never happen according to plan. So if you look at other, over the past 10, 15 years, there have been other events that have happened that have put resilience in the spotlight, if you will. If you think back to 2002, right? So 20 years ago, to the labor shutdown of the West Coast ports that, for 10 days, that, really, created some disruptions there, as well as the work slowdowns in the ports in 2014 and 2015. And of course, today happens to be the last day of the current agreement. So that's one of the risks that companies are looking at right now moving forward, is whether there's going to be any kind of labor strike or work slowdown at the West Coast ports in the weeks and months ahead. There's the 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami that disrupted many supply chains, particularly in automotive and high tech. And then just some of the challenges in 2018, with transportation and finding capacity, which really, increased rates and made it very difficult for companies to manage their transportation operations back then. And of course, the elephant in the room is, the COVID-19 pandemic, which over the past 2 years, have put resilience, back in the spotlight. And in fact, we asked members of our Indago supply chain research community. So this is a community of supply chain and logistics executives for manufacturing, retail, and distribution companies. This past April, we asked them, in response to the disruptions and challenges of the past 2 years, is making your supply chain more resilient a priority at your company, today? And more than 3/4 of the respondents, 76%, said that making their supply chains, more resilient is either a very high or high priority, today. So again, not surprising. I mean, I think whenever something of this magnitude occurs, resilience comes to the forefront. The key question is, do we learn? We talk about lessons learned. Well, do we actually end up then applying, these lessons? And I think that's going to be the key thing that's going to separate leaders from the laggards moving forward. Like I said, there have been other types of disruptions, other types of things that have caused resilience to be top of mind. But as we saw with 2020 and the past couple of years, a lot of companies didn't really take much action as a result, and found themselves in the same, challenging situations that, they found themselves again when the pandemic hit. And I particularly like a quote from Yossi Sheffi from MIT, Dr. Yossi Sheffi, and he wrote a back in 2005 called The Resilient Enterprise. And the quote that I like, I'm just going to read it here because I think it's worth keeping in mind, moving forward. And he wrote, thinking about disasters as opportunities and using disaster preparedness to increase resilience are the essence of making lemonade from lemons. The advantage of creating resilience is that it is a characteristic that gives enterprise buoyancy in the wake of any disruption, increasing its day-to-day flexibility to respond to a world that is changing fast and becoming ever less certain. Again, this is going back, almost 2 decades that he wrote that. But those words are as relevant today as ever before. So we asked our Indago, community, so what actions, do you foresee your company taking moving forward to create a more resilient, supply chain and company? So in terms of the actions that they plan to take, develop stronger and more transparent relationship with suppliers and improve real-time visibility to supply and demand topped the list, with 68% of the respondents selecting those actions. And then expand and diversify supplier base, rounded out the top 3. So again, for many years, we talked about the importance of having a demand-driven supply chain. Well, I think kind of the perspective has shifted because of all the disruptions that have occurred. Really, the situation we found ourselves with COVID was a huge increase in demand, but a constrained supply. So in many ways, companies have shifted from becoming demand-driven, at least temporarily, to becoming supply-driven over the past couple of years, really responding to what supply is available and really aligning their supply chains and their sales and other activities, around that. So I think that, that's just some food for thought, some things from some of your peers out in the industry in terms of resilience being top of mind and some of the actions that they plan to take. So with that, Bob, I'll bring it back to you.
Thanks very much, boy. It's just amazing how fast and radically things can change after years of staying the same. But thanks for that interesting brief, overview of supply chain resiliency. Now I want to turn it over to Jason Pant, who's going to tell us a little bit about Owens Corning.
Sure, thank you. Welcome everyone, and happy to be here today. Quick intro to Owens Corning. We are a global manufacturer of three major product lines: insulation, roofing, and composites. We have operations, as you can see here, in over 33 countries. Supply chain, all modes of transportation. We have well over 100 warehouse operations across the world, and each region has its own challenges that we'll work through. Just quickly around our business here, we do have a roofing business where we sell roofing shingles and accessories and underlayments. Global business. We have our insulation business, which is our pink insulation that you see in home centers. We also sell foam insulation and different types of installations for different levels of temperatures. This is also a global business. And then our last business is composites, which is more of a B2B, but transitioning into B2C businesses. We make glass that go into everything from wind blades to glass rebar for construction. These businesses all have different channels that we manage. And today I'll talk a little bit around how we're thinking of supply chain resiliency, how we've managed through COVID, changing from lots of supply to supply constrained, and how we manage that through to our customers and still provide a high level of service. So thank you again, and turn it back over to Bob.
Thanks very much, Jason, for that view of Owens Corning. Turn it over now to Bill King, who is going to tell us about SAP.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and just kind of dovetailing on what Adrian had mentioned and what you had mentioned also earlier, Bob, is, there's given the current market dynamics. We've been talking to different customers, different analysts and folks like that, and we've kind of summarized what we've gleaned from all those conversations in terms of what we see as being a new reality in supply chain overall, but of course logistics in particular, since that's where I tend to focus. And obviously supply chain resilience, as Adrian mentioned or alluded to, it's something we've always been talking about. Supply chain or managing supply chain is kind of required that, but it's just gotten increased focus, or at least increased spotlight, if you will, over the past couple of years. So in terms of resilience and trying to, how do I adapt, how do I react, things like that. And then in parallel, there's also been a trend even pre-COVID around Industry 4.0. But what does that mean from a logistics perspective? How do we have a logistics 4.0, if you will, where we work similarly, and instead of from a manufacturing perspective, from a logistics perspective? How do we optimize the flow of goods that are coming off the manufacturing line? Or how do we make sure we are maximizing our asset utilization or warehouse utilization, things like that? Where do we automate where we can? And then from in terms of integrity and transparency, this kind of touches on that visibility aspect that everybody's talking about, and we've been talking about probably since I've been in the supply chain field. Just gotten a lot more mature and a lot more visibility, or a lot more focus over the past few years, is how do I get that digital twin so that I can actually see in my internally what's going on in the outside world. Okay. And then we talk about the delightful delivery experience. It's been a trend for a number of years now, where even companies that you wouldn't typically think of as having like a end customer type of delivery requirement, you're seeing that more and more. Jason just mentioned, he's even seeing some, there's some movement within his own company from a B2B in some places to a B2C. So there's a lot of companies that are now having to look at that, that kind of experience. And then sustainability, I always joke, being a transportation guy, we were green before green was even cool, or was even a term. It's just gotten a lot more attention and a lot more focus over the past few years. So, transportation and logistics, where we've always looked at it, but just more from a pure business sense, it made more sense. It's feeding into a much bigger, much broader corporate initiative now. There's a lot of different companies out there that this is like a key part of their operating model. Those are some of the aspects in terms of how we see in new reality and logistics. Based on that, there's areas that we're innovating in, again, based on those realizations, but also based on the conversations. I won't go through all these or also take up the entire time today. But some of the big ones for us is logistics conversions. How do we tie together the different silos that you typically think of from logistics, from warehousing, transportation, yard management, yard logistics type of things? How do we tie them together more tightly so you're not throwing stuff over the wall? And then that also kind of bleeds into an internal visibility, if you will, which ties into that supply chain visibility, which again, some of it's just internally communicating, but also how do I communicate with the outside world? How do I connect to the different, networks, the different partners and so forth? And then automation, we're always trying to automate, we're always trying to improve productivity. So if you're somebody who's more manual, obviously you just, it's easier to adopt some of them are simple automation. But what if you're somebody who's a pretty automated company? You may be looking at the robotics type of capabilities that are out there now. Insights and intelligence is just a variation on the visibility. It's basically saying, looking at it from a higher level, looking at more from like a control room type situation of what's going on in my entire, logistics portfolio, and where are, my risks and where are my current, problems and what can I do? Experience management is how do I get that feedback from my stakeholders, whether it be customers or partners, for example, carriers, in terms of, how am I doing? Where can I improve so that I can, actually, continuous improvement, work on my processes. And then, security and data, document exchange, this is more like getting into leveraging some of the newer technologies out there, like blockchain, to facilitate processes that used to be very paper, very manual based, and bringing it, into the digital world. And then I've already mentioned sustainability. It's more than just like we used to worry about from driving fewer miles, driving fewer trucks, to capturing the CO2 emissions per mode, even down to a vehicle, and then taking that and also attributing that down to the item level, so that when I'm looking at it from as a corporation, what is the CO2 impact when I sell with this product or when I buy this product? And then just kind of give you a brief overview when we talk about logistics, what that means within SAP. It's really, kind of the things you would think about. So transportation management, which is where I play, it's my baby, if you will. And that's really focusing on managing the activities and movements between locations. The warehouse management is managing, the activities within the typically the four walls of a location. Yard logistics is that kind of that, what's managing between the handoff of transportation and the warehouse, so from the gate to the dock door. And available to promise is, how do I manage my inventory when I have back orders or restricted inventory or things like that? And all of them interact with each other. That's again the idea of trying to converge or have a converged logistics platform. And then there's the logistics business network, is how do I communicate with the outside world? I used to say, I stole this from somebody a few years ago, having like a TM or a logistics platform that doesn't talk to the outside world was kind of like having a solution that doesn't, an ATM that doesn't talk to a bank. But somebody pointed out that's kind of a dated analogy. A more timely one might be, it's like having a cell phone that can't connect to any, cellular service, any cellular network. So it's, again, this is, how do I communicate with the key stakeholders? And so that's kind of a quick overview of logistics here at SAP. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Bob.
Thank you so much, Bill, for that. I want to stay on camera, Bill. I want to bring back Adrian and Jason as well for the discussion part of our presentation here. So the three of you have done a great job of setting the table for us and helping us to understand a little bit about what is supply chain resilience today. Adrian did a great job of sketching that out. But I want to ask you, Bill, one of the things that Adrian pointed out was that there's nothing new about the concept of supply chain resilience. And in fact, Yossi Sheffi and his compatriots years ago have brought this up. I'm just wondering, why is it in the spotlight today in terms of actual action being taken as opposed to just talk? Or do you believe, Bill, that your customers are really taking it very serious now and taking real action toward achieving true supply chain resilience?
Yeah, first I'll take the second part of that first is, yeah, definitely folks are taking it seriously. Example I gave is we had a presentation I did 2 years ago with General Mills, and they talked about how at the very beginning of the pandemic, they had to quickly shift their operations. Because if you think about it, they're a company that supplied grocery stores and restaurants and, like cafeterias. Well, beginning of the pandemic with the shutdown, one part of that business pretty much, I won't say dried up, but it shrunk drastically, and the other one just blew up. And they needed, to be able to react and, you use the phrase, but be resilient and be able to shift and pivot very, very quickly. So for them, it was just probably one of the best examples in my mind of, our customers, really looking at this. Yes, very, very much so. And why it's, some of it's, we talked about, some of it's the pandemic, obviously that's the first and obvious, answer. But then there's also things like labor shortages. I think, Adrian, you mentioned like, the port shutdown, for 10 days a few years ago, but then there's been port shutdowns over the past 3 years for various reasons. Then there's the infamous, canal being shut down, the Suez Canal. Or I live in the Baltimore, Washington area. We actually had yet another container ship get stuck in the Baltimore harbor just a few months ago. So it's right, wrong, or indifferent. Somebody mentioned this also in another session. A few years ago, nobody necessarily, like my family and friends, didn't necessarily understand supply chain that well. Past few years, they definitely understand it a lot better. And I think that's part of it also. That's why it's in the spotlight, is because it's become, that's one thing the pandemic has done, is it's made it much more visible, to
Great,
just the out beyond our world.
great perspective, Bill. Thanks very much for that. And thanks for citing that General Mills example. And that leads me to wonder if there are some additional examples of actions that companies are taking to create a more resilient supply chain. Adrian, do you have some examples for us that you can kind of dramatize just what's going on out there in the real world?
Yeah, well, I think, just to build on what Bill just said, I mean, I think one of the differences today versus in the past, let's say, is that not only is supply chain more visible and understandable, if you will, to the average person. Certainly, it's the same thing with my family and those that I meet on the baseball fields and so forth. Now they actually understand what I do. But it's more importantly for our conversation, it's that the CEOs and CFOs have become much more educated and well versed in this topic, as well. So it's become, even more imperative for supply chain logistics executives to educate, if you will, their senior leaders in the C-suite. It still surprises me that so many companies still today do not have a chief supply chain officer, someone that is representing supply chain, if you will, in that C-suite. So the burden is really on supply chain executives, VPs, directors, and so forth, to really keep CEOs, CFOs informed in terms of the day-to-day and what's happening out there, but also some of those actions that need to, that need to happen. I think first and foremost, I think companies that, we have been talking about, the importance of digitizing, right? Or the digital transformation. And like so many things, analysts, consultants, technology companies, we had all been talking about the importance of that. And, but, some companies, again, weren't taking that much action. I think, the pandemic and the events of the past 2 years, the ripple effects of everything that we've talked about, have really forced companies to really take a look at their enterprise applications as one action area, because they're realizing that, hey, you know what, if we're still doing things manually, if we don't have visibility to supply and demand, I mean, that was one of the things that came out that companies are taking. I said, we need better visibility to supply and demand. We need better ways to take a more unified approach to the way we manage our planning, operations, execution processes, and so forth. And we can't do that with Excel spreadsheets. We can't do that with systems that were built back in 1995 and so forth. So I think that's one key area, particularly from a technology standpoint, is companies are accelerating their digital transformation efforts that perhaps they have put on hold, or they felt they had more time to get to they realize that we're more than 2 years into this, and there's still a lot of risk and uncertainty out there, that they can't continue to work like it's still 1999 in 2022. So
Yeah.
Hey,
I
Bob,
mean,
I'd like to add one too.
please do. Please do.
I think Bill talked around labor shortages at the ports and carriers and all over, but as a manufacturing company, we also feel it from our own employees. So the turnover in our warehouses and our manufacturing plants of either people being out due to COVID or just the competitive job market. I think we look at a couple ways of addressing that. One is automation, even from automating our warehouse operations in some areas, but the people side, how do you make your facilities a destination where you can attract talent, great working environment, great policies and tools. So when we talk of digital transformation, some of our focus is how do you provide the digital capability as new hires come in and new employees that can quickly ramp up and be able to execute at a high level by having those digital assets available versus relying on tribal knowledge and transfer of processes from person to person where you may lose some of that expertise. So I think there's a couple areas of focus there just on the people side that's going to be very important in the supply chain resiliency.
People and technology. Sounds like Owens Corning is really walking the walk on this one. You guys are definitely totally aware of the importance of resilience, I'm guessing. And in fact, what you were saying, Adrian, it's interesting that we even see some selected instances of companies achieving appointing so-called chief risk officers. Now, I don't know if that might be a little bit trendy for the C-suite, but at least it shows a growing awareness of the need for the intersection of risk management and resilience and the like. Okay, you guys are telling me about technology and automation, and I have to say that as an editor, I'm constantly receiving pitches from companies who want to tell me about how technology, quote unquote, is a solution to supply chain resilience. And yet it's not so easy just to plug in a solution and you're off and running and everything's great. What technology challenges do companies face today in making their supply chains more resilient? Adrian?
Yeah, no, great point. I mean, I think there's always the danger of, and I wrote about this recently, always the danger of looking at technology as a silver bullet, solution to all these problems, because it can't solve everything, right? And but as Jason just talked about, I mean, you've got labor issues, you got other things that are challenging, but technology is a facilitator. It's an enabler of some of the objectives that you have. We actually asked our Indago community that question. What's some of the biggest challenges you face or gaps you face in terms of trying to create a resilient supply chain? And the survey results, weren't too encouraging. I mean, only 32% of the survey respondents rated their technology capabilities either as excellent or good in terms of helping them, make their supply chains more resilient. And more than half of the respondents, 56%, rated their technology capabilities as just fair. So I think there's a lot, there's a long way to go there. So the question is, so where are the gaps? I mean, why are companies rating it, that way? And I think Bill brought this up. Supply chain, functions historically have been kind of operated in silos, right? So for example, transportation, warehousing, and yard, are often optimized independently of one another, even though these in those three functions, are interdependent, with one another. So when you look at the survey results, it's not surprising that the respondents ranked our software applications are poorly integrated, and we lack cross-functional optimization capabilities among the top three technology-related challenges that they face in making their supply chains more resilient. And rounding out the top three was lack of real-time visibility to supply and demand. So I think that's where the focus needs to be, is to say, hey, how do we do a better job of not only integrating these applications, but really integrating the metrics, integrating the processes, and putting a layer of optimization that really spans across these different functional areas, because that's what's going to really drive the most intelligent decisions and actions, moving forward. And then of course is the visibility, which we always talk about, a lot. There's still a lot of black holes around visibility, across the supply chain. So it's investing in those areas to have as much visibility to inventory in motion, inventory at manufacturing facilities, and of course on the demand side as well, so you can do a better job of, on a more real-time basis, match supply with demand.
Yeah, I love the idea of the cell phone without a without a cell network, the ATM without a bank. The idea that technology becomes a means of collaboration and communication. Now, Bill, SAP goes back to practically prehistory, the old days of ERP, enterprise resource planning, which was essentially an internally focused function. Now, of course, you're so much more. It's all about reaching out to supply chain partners. How do you feel, though? I mean, what challenges do your customers tell you that they face in trying to adopt these solutions that we're talking about now?
A lot of what Adrian said, like visibility, is top of mind for a lot of folks. Again, I've been in the TMS space since the late 90s, and I want to make sure that's the 1990s, not 1890s. But my kids always like to remind me of that. But we've been talking about visibility for decades, but really it seems like in the past 5+ years, it's a market and area that's really matured, with varying degrees, of success and adoption, either by mode or by region. But that's an area that a lot of folks are looking at. That's why we started to go into the networks, like I mentioned, the LBN, because we needed to be able to connect to all those different players. And then also, from our perspective, and again, it's looking at supply chain as a silo. I mean, even within logistics, you have the silos between warehousing and transportation, but then also planning and manufacturing. Are we all talking to each other as we need to and when we need to? And in the way we need to. And then also, are you having fragmented approaches? Do you approach things one way for domestic versus international? Or even if, I've even seen it where you've approached things differently, domestically, inbound versus outbound. Do you need to look at, having a standardized way of approaching things, at least from like a function, like from a transportation perspective? These are all things I hear from folks to varying degrees. So.
Great. Adrian, you were just talking about visibility and some of the gaps that exist, the so-called black holes. Could you be a little more specific as to where some of these biggest black holes are in supply chains today?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, this was a question we asked our Indigo members, and, we had them kind of rank, across the different nodes across the supply chain where they felt they had excellent visibility versus, very poor visibility. 84% of the Indigo survey respondents said that they had either excellent or good visibility, real-time visibility to inventory within their warehouses. So that's not, too surprising, right? Because that's something that is typically within their own four walls. Presumably they have a warehouse management system. So it's something that it's closest to them, right? So it's not surprising that they had excellent or very good, visibility to inventory in their warehouses. But at the same time, where they had kind of the black holes was having real-time visibility to inventory at their suppliers, right? So 41% of the Indigo members rated it as poor or very poor, and also inventory at our yards. So it's funny when you think about, hey, the warehouse is within our, domain, if you will, and they have excellent to very good visibility there. But right outside, when it comes to their yards, 33% rated it as poor or very poor, that they had visibility to the inventory within their yards. And I think that's just a maturity level in terms of a lot more companies have implemented warehouse management systems over the years than they have yard management systems. And I think that's one of the main reasons why yard management systems are in the spotlight today, because as companies are going through this process that I talked about before to say, hey, where do we need to move up the digital transformation curve? Where are we doing things manually with a lot of paper-driven processes and so forth? In the area of logistics, the yard is kind of the last man standing, if you will, right? The companies have invested in TMS, WMS, and now yard is the area that they're weakest and need to improve. I have a quote here from one of the Indigo members that commented, and this executive wrote, "Supply chain visibility is critical to developing resilience. However, as we lack these tools, right? So the visibility and the ability, the optimization across functions and so forth. As we lack these tools, we are employing more traditional approaches, such as increased inventory, right? So the way that companies have historically responded to poor visibility is to hold more inventory. And again, even that's more challenging today because it's harder to get product because of all the disruptions in the marketplace. And of course, now you have rising interest rates and everything else. So the cost of capital, the cost of holding inventory is more expensive. So that creates its own challenges as well. So again, I think the visibility, some of the black holes, visibility to real-time inventory at suppliers and what's outside your own yards are two of the areas that I think companies need to be focusing on more.
Great, thanks for that. I want to ask you all about general trends in logistics and transportation specifically. How have they changed since the pandemic started? Jason, what do you think?
Sure, I'll just highlight one here that I found interesting as more and more technology is in the hands of our carriers. We're starting to see the trends now where carriers are rating us as a company on facilities, ease of loading, all the things that makes their lives easier. And carriers have a choice who they're gonna haul for. And it's an area we need to focus on, and we do focus on, is making sure we provide a good experience for our customers, but a good experience for our carriers also. So we can get hopefully a more fair share of the market with our transportation partners. I think that's going to be a trend that's going to continue on, that everyone's used to rate your Uber driver, rate your Lyft driver, and that's the trend we're seeing now with rate the company that you're hauling for.
Shipper of choice. That's the big thing these days in terms of making yourself attractive to carriers when capacity is such low availability. Bill, what do you think? What are some general logistics and transportation trends that you're seeing at SAP?
It's interesting. So just piggybacking on what Jason said, I mean, we're seeing that. We're also seeing, kind of dovetailing with that is, looking at, like you said, shipper of choice or basically, location of choice. Because I think you can get down even to the, within a shipper, you could have multiple facilities. Some are good, some are bad. But also it's forcing folks to look at alternative sourcing strategies or alternative carriers. There's also, to some degree, looking at, different modes. But, I think just it's a bigger issue, I think, within trucking, we'll call it that, is, how, Jason said, you have carriers have a choice of who they want to haul for. So, how are you managing the sourcing aspect or process with those guys? If you had commitments with them, but they're not actually being able, not moving the loads that you were originally or contracted lanes, how do you cover those lanes? That you thought you had secure capacity. How what are the other options there? I'm talking to a lot of different folks where there's different capacity networks as well as visibility networks, and it's different regionally. I mean, I think it was more so during the pandemic. You could see it like, again, I'm based in the mid-Atlantic. You had, at times, Pennsylvania was much worse than other places. So it's not just capacity networks, but also how are you addressing it from a regional perspective? And those are just some of the things I'm seeing.
Yeah, Adrian, you alluded to yard management. That certainly is an aspect of logistics and transportation, and good yard management certainly does lead to making you a more attractive shipper in terms of reducing wait time for trucks in the yard, availability of equipment, chassis, and things like that. What do you see in the broader picture in logistics and transportation? What kind of trends have you seen otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo, what Jason and Bill said. I mean, I think there is a lot of focus today on freight procurement, right? I think we've done some surveys here where we've asked the question, is it time to transform or innovate the freight procurement process? And I think overwhelmingly both shippers and carriers say yes, right? So the days of setting and forgetting, the annual bid, and you kind of set up your routing guide and then look at it for the rest of the year. I mean, those days are long gone. So you're seeing this trend towards And it's being facilitated by the fact that we've got more access to data today than ever before in terms of real-time market data and what's happening with contract rates, what's happening with spot rates, what's happening with rejection rates, and so forth. There's a lot of data from a lot of different sources out there that both shippers and carriers have access to. So I think that's enabling both sides to engage in more dynamic procurement engagements, right? So more shorter term, more frequent, to Bill's point, addressing certain lanes or certain regions of the market, because each market, each lane is perhaps a little bit different and changes differently over time. So I think that's one, aspect of it is companies are relooking and innovating the way they go to market in terms of their freight procurement process. I think we're seeing more and more today with automation. I think Bill brought that up as well. So and so did Jason, right? Adding automation to their warehouses, to the manufacturing locations. Part of it is, as always, productivity, efficiency. Part of it is a response to the labor problem. And I think, we did an episode on Talking Logistics a few months back that really put the focus on the labor problem. And it goes beyond COVID. It's not just a pandemic related issue. It's a fact that, we've got an aging population, not only here in the United States, but around the world, right? So the reality is that over time, there's going to be fewer and fewer younger folks to, take on these jobs because people are not, the population replacement rate is not happening, at the level that it needs to be to take into account retirements and deaths. So that's a long-term problem. So I think that's fueling some of the automation. And then third, I think it's sensors, right? So for a long time, we talked about RFID. Not only at the retail level at the stores, but also leveraging sensors to be able to track inventory in motion and track assets. The technology there continues to improve. The price points continue to come down. So I think moving forward, you're going to see more and more sensors, applied across the supply chain, again, to provide additional real-time data and insights, that companies can then feed that into their supply chain software applications to facilitate with some of the optimization and automated process execution that Bill talked about. So I think those are three things that I see from my perspective.
That's a good future view. Bill, what do you think in terms of future types of applications, technology? You've certainly done a good job of laying out for us what's going on today. How might this evolve in the future technologically?
I think we've hit on a lot of it. I mean, I think visibility is here to stay. Adrian, it's a good catch or a good point about IoT because it's like a subset in some ways of visibility because it's getting down to container or truck level layers or visibility, like what's the temperature, what's the humidity, that kind of thing from an individual container. Also, I think there's, automation. It just that's not going away. The sourcing, I think, is going to definitely be something that we're going to be continue to look at for various reasons. We've covered a lot of them. The driver shortage, it seems like it's been something we've been talking about since I got into this space.
Yeah,
sure. and it's just continued. One thing we didn't talk about, and I'm curious to see if it has legs, is the idea of nearshoring. Because of the challenges of having to source so much from transoceanic, and then also changes to, and this gets out of my the logistics space, but still within supply chain, of what kind of changes are we going to see having sustained or continued beyond the short term, is changes in inventory patterns and inventory strategies. Which kind of dovetails with nearshoring too. But those are just some of the areas that, I've seen some changes over the past couple of years. I'm curious to see that how what the longevity is with those.
Okay.
So,
Jason,
I think
give me your long view, Jason.
I was going to say, I think sustainability being another key area. You talked about it earlier, but how do we start to optimize our supply chains with not just a cost or service view, but also a sustainability view? Everything from our supply planning to what carrier we're selecting, what type of vehicle do they have, is electric vehicle versus a diesel. I mean, those are all things that I think are going to be future requirements we're gonna want to put into our optimizers as we get smarter around our carbon footprint.
Thank you very much for that. Now we're getting short on time, so I'm going to close off the discussion part of our presentation and move to some audience questions. And even as we are answering those questions, audience members are encouraged to continue to submit your questions by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can, time permitting. So here's a question for the group, I think. Has the perspective changed in how manufacturers measure their execution success and customer experience? Adrian, maybe I'll start with you on that.
Can you repeat the question again? I'm sorry, Bob.
Has perspective changed in how manufacturers measure their execution success and customer experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think more needs to change. I think, you know, the customer experience, this is an area that we've done research on for the past few years. So customer experience is becoming a competitive differentiator, you know, for companies, right? So it's no longer just competing on lowest cost, right? But the service component of it has become critically, you know, more important. You know, part of this, you can argue it's part of the Amazon effect, right? That's been happening in retail and B2C, and that has spilled over into the B2B realm as well, where, you know, it's about, you see that in on time and full. You see that in being able to, again, customer requirements are becoming more and more demanding, and those companies that are able to meet the service component of it, obviously at a competitive cost, are going to be the ones that are going to be the most successful moving forward. So I would say yes. I would say that as part of the way that question was phrased, is that customer experience is now part of that equation, part of the metric that gets looked at. And going beyond just the cost factor, which for many years, and I came out of manufacturing myself, it was always about, you know, the lowest unit cost was always the manufacturing, you know, perspective. But now service and customer experience are being, you know, if you're looking at it from a balanced scorecard perspective, that's being added as part of it as well.
What do you think about that, Jason? I mean, your the customer profile varies widely from industrial and B2B and B2C. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the measurements, obviously different levels based on the type of customer. A distributor that we're shipping to that's replenishing their safety stock has a different level of what they're expecting from a on-time delivery. Maybe they're okay with a window delivery because they're not, you know, having to have that inventory ready to ship the next day. So they may be okay with a 1 or 2 day late. They still you know, think that is passing a on-time delivery metric. Whereas someone who's a job site that needs an elevator in New York City and only has it for 2 hours, they're going to, you know, highly value that shipment getting there exactly when it needs to get there. So I think you've got to get to understanding what your customer values to understand how you want to measure success. In our world right now, you know, 2 years ago, we had lots of inventory. So a lot of measurements we were focused on were how do we track to the customer's request and really fine tune our system to deliver what the customer requested. When we're short on product and we're managing, you know, capacity and allocation to customers, we want to measure how well we do what we say we're going to do. So if you want it next Tuesday and we say we don't have material until Thursday, we want to measure that we hit Thursday because we want to communicate early to our customers what we say we're going to do and then deliver on that. So depending on the market, the metrics change. And again, it's getting down to the customer on what they value, and not all customers are the same.
Thanks very much for that, Jason. And indeed, we have a question specifically for Owens Corning, for you, Jason. So here it is. Is Owens Corning exploring third-party inventory ownership services, remember VMI, to build up safety and buffer stocks to mitigate disruption, yet off balance sheet until you need the inventory?
Yeah, I would say from a customer, our customers, we are looking for introducing VMI programs for our customers with our products. So we have done that with some of our key customers, and we look at that as a opportunity for us to balance our supply chain a little differently. If we're able to replenish, we can make different decisions on when we want to ship. Maybe we ship on a Tuesday where our warehouse isn't quite as loaded, but we still service the customer on time. In general, right now though, we're pretty tight on inventory in most of our segments, so we're selling pretty much everything we make, but we're always looking for different opportunities to put resiliency in our supply chain. We are heavily using third-party warehouses across the country, across the world. So I think those are strategies we'll look at and continue to look at.
Thank you. Maybe this one for Bill. Question is, how do you see the use of legacy EDI, that is electronic data interchange transaction protocols, impacting the industry when it comes to modernization and automation? Should we continue to invest in that technology for shipment automation and visibility perspective? Is EDI still alive, Bill?
Yes, the reported death of EDI was premature. Let's put it that way. No, I still, just in the past few quarters, I've dealt with some customers that they basically were all in on EDI. So I think there's still going to be folks using it, especially if they have a investment already, or if they have a strong EDI shop, if you will, in their location. Obviously, API is where I think the industry is moving and looking to. So I could see, transitioning eventually to API. I know we're agnostic. We basically support both. So it's a matter of, or if you're starting out, from an automation perspective, you might not look to EDI initially, and you might look to API. If you're already using EDI, then continue to use it, but then start to look at, how do I make that transition? At least that's the way I see it. So
yeah, API, application programming interface. Here's a question. Let's see who wants to take this one. In the past, we generally managed our direct suppliers with all of the issues during the past few years. We're finding that we have to manage our suppliers and their sub-suppliers. Here we talk about the multi-tier supply chain, often multiple tiers into the supply line. Do you see other companies doing this and identifying software solutions that can track and utilize this data? Adrian, what do you think about the multi-tier supply chain and the challenges that come with that now in supplier management?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It's a great point. And this goes back to, when we talk about resilience, there's sub segments of resilience, and part of it is risk management. And I think, and we talk about visibility, right? So a lot of times when we talk about visibility, we talk about visibility to shipments, visibility to inventory. But one of the areas that's another big black hole is that, and we've done research in this area as well, is that companies generally have good visibility to their tier one suppliers, but they're almost blind to, tier two and tier three and beyond. And what ends up happening is that there might be a critical supplier or a critical component or a critical material that is being provided by a tier two or tier three that they don't have visibility to. And that supplier goes out of business, or that supplier, they're in an area where there's an earthquake and their plant goes down. And all of a sudden, I think there've been articles over the years where you see where a single screw or a nut or a bolt, that comes from a tier two or tier three supplier. All of a sudden that supply, because a single source gets knocked out, and that has huge ramifications for the end customer, because now they can't produce any of their airplanes or any of their cars or any of their machinery just because of that one, part that goes out. So one of the leading practices, and what I think some of the leaders are doing, is they're beginning to map their supply chain. So this is kind of a whole category of supply chain mapping. It goes along with what Bill talked about earlier in terms of supply chain design, of building a digital twin of your supply chain. So part of building your digital twin of your supply chain is really mapping your supply chain, understand all the different tiers, and understanding where all these manufacturers and suppliers are, what they produce at each of their manufacturing locations, and then how that translates into your product portfolio, your manufacturing plans. It's a very huge effort. It takes a lot of time, resources, etc. But it's something that companies have talked about for a long time, but haven't walked the talk. But it is critically important to do if we're talking about truly setting up your business and your supply chain, to be resilient and to minimize risk, moving forward.
All right, thanks for that. We are just about out of time. We have time for one final question, and it is as follows. if you had to leave companies with one piece of advice around their logistics operations and initiatives, what would it be? Jason.
Sure. I think I mentioned it earlier. I think it's not one size fits all. I think you have to get intimate and understand your customers, what they value, and then work back from the problem you're solving to the business rules, you go to market, and then configure the systems to meet those requirements. Don't start with the shiny object technology and try to find the solution for it. I think you've got to start with the customer and work your way back.
Thank you. Bill, what do you think? One piece of advice.
For me, I think it's take a holistic approach, take a long-term view towards it. You need to look at things from an end-to-end perspective so that you're looking at, not just one specific function within your logistics operations or within your supply chain. Make plans so that they can account for growth and changing business, and obviously kind of tailored to what our conversation today is, also any kind of disruptions. So make sure you're looking at a flexible way of approaching things, or a resilient way of approaching things, I should say.
Thank you. Adrian, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. Well, we actually produced a research report in partnership with SAP, which I think is going to be published soon, where we highlight 4 guiding principles that companies ought to kind of take a look at or consider moving forward. So I'll just mention the first one, which I think is very important and relative to our conversation today, and that is to balance supply chain cost and efficiency with resilience, risk, and sustainability. So for a long time, companies have always balanced, cost with efficiency, productivity, and trying to meet their customer, requirements. But now, if you're thinking about juggling those 2 balls, you got to add some more balls into that equation, into that juggling act. And that is also include resilience, risk, and sustainability as part of that. Because those are going to be the factors that moving forward are going to separate the leaders from the laggards, those that are able to effectively balance not just cost and efficiency. It's not just about, because sometimes, what we saw over the past, few years is that companies made their supply chain so lean, so efficient, and so forth, that when a disruption occurred, from a resilience standpoint, from a risk standpoint, and even now from a sustainability standpoint, they were behind the 8 ball. So I think that's my my key recommendation.
Great. Well, what is so great about this discussion is that we're not just talking, or for all the perils that supply chains have experienced in the last couple of years, we're not talking about survival. We're talking about excellence, delighting the customer in the face of these great crises, and how companies can use this to their advantage to compete in the marketplace. So with that, I want to thank our fantastic speakers for today: Adrian Gonzalez of Indago and Talking Logistics, Jason Pant of Owens Corning, Bill King of SAP. Thank you for your very, very valuable insights. Audience, thanks for listening in. Thanks for your incredibly astute questions. And with that, thanks again to everybody. Stay well and have a great day. Oh, and by the way, there's Bill King's contact number right there, contact information. There's where you can reach him for more information about SAP. Everybody, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.